All right. Hello, everyone. I am joined here today by my excellent friend, Dr. AP Canavan. Hello, AP. How are you?
I am doing very well. Nemesis. I have heard the slurs and slanders and
Oh,
awful
no.
things that you've been saying about me all over your channel.
Oh, no, no. Really? Huh. Can't
And
imagine what you're alluding to.
and I know for a fact that you've been alluding that there's some secret puppetry going on, some
Oh, yeah.
evil mastermind, that all of like this is a disguise. I have had my researchers on the case and they have uncovered the following truth.
Uh-oh.
No, I need everyone to be prepared because this will shock you.
Oh, dear. I didn't know you came prepared here.
There it is, ladies and gentlemen. Undeniable proof that Philip is in fact a lizard man wearing a human skin. This is how evil and nefarious the doctor of fantasy is.
Well, Dr. Canavan, I did have someone recently refer to you as Professor Liar Balls. So, so I don't know if we should believe the obviously manipulated image that we had up there. Oh dear. Okay, well, we are here today, ladies and gentlemen, for a very serious purpose. We are here today to discuss the film The Northman. And I actually did a video earlier, which was a look at the source kind of thing, where I gave basically a summary of the story told by Saxo Grammaticus in the Gesta Danorum in the latter half of book 3 and the first half of book 4 of that rather large, sprawling legendarium history, whatever you want to call it. So I talked about the source material there. That is a video you can take a peek at if you haven't, but I thought it would be a fun thing to do before I sat down with you to discuss the film, which we have both now seen. And we have some opinions, we have some thoughts on this film. So I'd like to start with you, actually, and get your general thoughts. Maybe we could do a little non-spoiler first, kind of general thoughts. And then a little bit later, we'll get into more details and spoilers and that sort of thing.
Okay, so without spoilers, this is a weird film for me because in some respects, I am really glad that I saw it. That there are aspects of it that I really enjoyed. There are aspects of it I thought were incredibly well done. But if someone said to me, "Hey Pete, do you want to go and sit and watch this film again?" I'm like, not really, no, because it wasn't a particularly fun experience. And I think before we started, I was talking about there are two other films that I've seen relatively recently that I kind of put in the same category as this, and I'll explain why in a second. But they were The Green Knight and The Last Duel, and I think for all three of these films, what was set up as an expectation in the trailer for them, what style of film they were, what you were kind of expecting to go in, the kind of mood and atmosphere that you were expecting going in, that what was delivered wasn't necessarily what you expected from the trailer. And if you weren't flexible enough to sort of go, oh, I'm getting a different thing, let's see what this thing is doing,
right,
it can sort of put you on the back foot. And I think The Last Duel, The Green Knight, and The Northman have all done this to a greater or lesser extent.
And you were lied to by a trailer?
It's a trailer, it's marketing. You always take it with a pinch of salt.
Yeah.
What is it? The Green Knight for me was very much an art house film.
Yeah.
And even though the trailer was potentially misleading about the levels of action in it, I went in knowing it was going to be an art house film and therefore was comfortable watching an art house film.
Yeah.
With The Last Duel, a lot of the trailers seemed to suggest it was going to be quite epic and about these medieval knights and all of this fighting. What I got there was something almost unexpected. And in fact, I enjoyed a lot more because I was expecting something I thought was going to be a sort of bland, generic, medieval-esque knights hitting each other film, and it turned into something a great deal more thought-provoking.
Yeah.
And I think it happened almost in reverse for the Northman. Because of Vikings, because of The Last Kingdom, both very popular TV shows, and because of the trailer, I had an expectation about the tone and style of this film.
Yeah.
That was entirely me projecting onto it. And so when I watched it, I was taken aback. I wasn't expecting the film that I got. Now, as I said at the very beginning, I'm glad I watched it. I think it's an excellent film. But in terms of enjoyable, that is going to vary wildly person to person. And it's not necessarily based on your expectations because of the trailer.
Yeah.
What do you think about those sorts of comparisons?
Well, it's interesting because I actually did think of The Green Knight. And I didn't see the other movie you mentioned. It's one that I definitely want to see. It sounds really interesting. But I did think of The Green Knight, interestingly, because there again, I totally agree with you. I do think the trailer did sell it as a little bit more conventional epic type film. And what it was very much an art house film, and a very good one, I thought. I enjoyed The Green Knight a lot, and it did some things really well. I love how it incorporated myth and the ambiguities in it. And I think there's some of that as well in the Northman. There definitely are mythological elements in here. I like that they went for that. I really do. And the ambiguities in here as well. There's a lot of dreamlike stuff that happens. And so you're not really sure. I think I would have liked to have gone into it expecting those dreamlike elements and those mythological elements, those illusions. It would have been better for me as a viewer, I think, if I expected that rather than a more straightforward kind of epic narrative based on a revenge tale, essentially. And there are some elements of it that are very saga-like. If you were, for example, to read the Icelandic sagas, Grettir the Strong or Egil's saga, you would recognize the type of protagonist that you see in the Northman. I mean, these are, I want to say amoral, but they're very gray, gritty characters who have they're obsessed. They're like Ahab-like characters who go on a rampage, and it's more like we're in awe, not that we identify with these characters.
But it's interesting you said amoral, because morality, we have to remember that today's morality is radically different to the morality back then. And the cultural shifts, the different attitudes to things, trying to understand it from that perspective. And this happens when we read epics from the various different time periods, that things that are culturally accepted and therefore no attention is drawn to them, that a contemporary audience would have gone, oh yeah, I know exactly what they're talking about, and oh yeah, that makes perfect sense because that's what I would do in that situation. We look at as a modern audience, as a modern readership or a modern viewer, and go, what the hell? Like, why are they doing that? That makes no sense. I thought this was meant to be a good guy. Why is he acting that way? Or why is she doing that? Or that's really evil. And it's because the culture is so radically different. And those stories were written for a contemporary audience. This story is trying to recreate that for a modern audience. And there's I think a slight disconnect between aiming for a level of cultural authenticity and forgetting to translate it for the modern audience, which I think that's where part of the disconnect comes in.
Yeah. So, for example, and this is not a spoiler, just to be specific, vengeance is actually a moral obligation according to the older Germanic, pagan culture, and that is a aspect of their morality that, in theory at least, we modern people frown upon. Well,
we like to think so.
We like to think so. But they embraced vengeance. And it was, in fact, if you did not obtain vengeance for someone close to you who was killed, then you were seen as morally bankrupt, as inadequate, as shirking your duty. So that's an aspect of this that certainly does come into play in a very specific way in the Northman, of course, and being based on the story of Amleth, which of course is related to the story of Hamlet and other revenge tales where there's a father figure, a patriarch, murdered by a nefarious uncle who then marries the protagonist's mother, and then the protagonist has to somehow or other obtain vengeance. I think it's a pretty common pattern going way back into various mythological times, really. So,
well, on the we can start talking about Oedipus.
yeah, oh yeah. I mean,
but this is a family-friendly channel.
Yeah.
Although Oedipus was all about family.
Oh, dear me. Well, Oedipus is going to come up again, I think, when we talk spoilers, but AP, that was really bad. He was a family man indeed. So
he loved his mother.
Oh, he just loved her to pieces. But this is a very serious discussion, right? So
yeah.
So my general impressions, I would give the film a thumbs up. There are many aspects to it that have my complete admiration, but it is a very grim story. It is a very bleak story. It's not uplifting. It's an interesting look into human nature. And I think there are some very unpleasant truths that are gazed at unflinchingly. So it is a film I admire, and I probably would rewatch it, actually, though I'm going to give myself some time before I do that.
Yeah. So without going into any spoilers, just to talk about a couple of the aspects, I think, without giving away anything about what actually happens in it.
Yeah.
In terms of the cinematography, in terms of the shooting of the landscape, in terms of some of those dream sequences and that sort of mythological aspect that you were referring to, I thought it was all really beautifully and wonderfully shot.
Yeah.
And there's at times the atmosphere of the film is reflected in the savagery of the landscape, and then is contrasted with the beauty of a very savage landscape, but it is wonderfully beautiful. And you have that dynamic between beauty and savagery, that they are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And I think that's a lot of what's going on in the film, particularly with the character of Amleth and the power of the emotions and duty and all of these different aspects of what family and life mean, that there is savagery to this culture, but there's also beauty to it, that the recreation of and allusions to a lot of the religious practices and the mythology, again, is walking that line of a savage beauty all the way through, that it can be both appreciated as well as feared. It can be loathed as well as desired. That everything about this film is about that sort of dynamic binary, about switching between the two, that it is both driving you away as well as trying to pull you in. And that tension, I think, reflects a lot of Amleth's character arc. A lot of the tension in the film is about that dynamic. And I thought the scenery did that, the acting did that, the balance between the real and the unreal did that. All of these aspects all played into this binary. And so you look at it as a piece of filmmaking and go, it is amazingly cohesive, that these sudden shifts in emotion are actually signaled all the way through in everything. That binary is always there. And seeing that, you go, this is masterfully put together. This is masterfully shot. At times the soundtrack is intrusive and blaring and really obvious, and other times is very subtle and drawing you further in. And again, it's this constant wave motion between these two, almost like polar opposites. So I thought, as a package like that, I really was impressed with that stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, the cinematography A plus. I mean, just beautiful. Of course, can you take a bad picture of a landscape in Iceland? I don't know. Is that even possible? And it's just the film was shot in several locations, but just brilliant stuff. And I love the camera work. There are certain scenes that we can talk about where the camera kind of moves in and follows the characters. It's really good stuff what they do, and the close-ups and everything, showing the tension and the emotion on the faces. The music for me was absolutely a wonderful part of this, just fantastic. I heard that they even did it on period instruments, so there's a level of authenticity to the music, which is pretty darn cool for the nerd historian or whatever in me, the medievalist.
Nerdemic.
Yeah, exactly. So I just thought the music was absolutely conducive to the right tone and the right mood for this film, and an integral part of the overall effect of the story. It can be tied to the music, actually. So really happy with the soundtrack. In fact, I think I probably will go out and buy a CD. I still buy CDs of the soundtrack.
Philip, do you need to take a moment to explain what CDs are to your younger audience members?
Yeah, those little circular things that play music. Yeah, I mean, you put them in this thing called a CD player, and they spin around, and so they know what CDs are still, I think. Yeah, no, I mean, the soundtrack's brilliant. The historical, so while we're talking about period instruments and all that, the level of attention paid to the details of the ships and the mead hall and the layout of the farm and everything. I mean, just everything. I think as a medievalist, and I'm not a complete expert in every aspect of this, like I'm not, I know a little bit about weapons and such, but I think that from what I can tell, there's a level of authenticity that they went for here that's truly impressive, that they did their homework. They really did their homework here. And I think that pays off, that level of attention to detail. It can have an effect on a viewer that you're not even aware of at the time as a viewer, but it lends to the experience nevertheless. And I think they did really fantastic work in that regard. And then there's the acting, which, it's a bleak story. It's very kind of chiaroscuro. It's very, light and shadow and very bleak and strong. And I think the acting reflects that in many senses, particularly the protagonist, Amleth, played by Alexander Skarsgård. I would give them very high ratings for the acting as well. I think that everybody in the cast did fantastic work as far as that goes. They really played their parts. I think they achieved the effect that they were going for. And so you blend all that stuff together along with the inclusion of the myth and the legend, and I think you've got and the obvious kind of, even though Saxo Grammaticus was a Dane, he wasn't from Iceland. I never went to Iceland or anything like that, but they clearly were going for Icelandic saga vibes there, to the degree that they changed the locales in some cases. Really, they altered a lot about the original story. It's not really it's a very loose adaptation, in fact. But you add all that together, and I do think it's a very successful film overall, but very, very tough viewing.
Yeah, I mean, it's not one of those where you go, you know what, honey, let's sit down and we're going to watch a nice movie together. This is not the film you pick for that.
Nope.
Well, do you want to move into some spoiler territory then?
Yeah, I think it's time for us to move into the spoilers. I think we said about as much as we can without doing that. So everyone, this is the warning. We are now going to be talking about spoilers. So AP, would you like to start us off with a particular scene?
Well, one of the first things I wanted to mention was there's obviously two major scenes in this where Skarsgård as Amleth goes swimming. And the first thing that immediately reminded me of is Beowulf.
Oh, of course.
And it was if they went, you know what, let's use this, we're going to put this in. And just with the focus on it, I went, that's Beowulf that they're evoking.
Yeah.
And so that, again, tying in those moments to more recognizable epics, and more well-known epics, I think was absolutely fantastic. And then the depiction of being a berserker, that we have all of these different legends and myths that have grown around berserkers. And this was a wonderful iteration of it. Is it the most historically accurate? I don't know. I'm not an expert on that.
Yeah.
But it was certainly believable that they created a potentially very believable version of what a berserker was, how a berserker acted. And because of that, the sort of the dancing around the bonfire in a sort of very primal evocation, the chanting, the calling on the gods, the drawing on the mythic, the wearing of the skins, and then losing themselves in that bestial rage, assuming that it is giving them more power, their belief in it. That, I thought, for a modern audience, sometimes we look at things like that and go, oh, well, that could be kind of silly. But it was so period appropriate, or at least appeared period appropriate. And it was a very believable way of articulating this, that you could really visualize and understand that they believed that this was channeling animal rage and power.
Yeah.
And so I think some people in the modern audience might look at that and go, oh, well, that was kind of silly. But I don't know a more realistic way they could have portrayed what being a berserker was without it suddenly becoming overblown and them actually transforming into wolves. I thought this was fantastically done, that idea of the battle rage.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about the beast aspects of the film for a bit. There's that scene where the young Amleth with his father, when they go, he has his rite of passage into manhood, and it involves essentially being a beast, being a dog, along with his father, but also coming out of that as a man, right? So emerging from that as a man. And you have the scene where you have the berserkers or the wolf hides all together in that group, and they're doing their dance and their ritual. It was slightly reminiscent, perhaps, of a frat party, but there was.
Well, and it's channeling a very similar, bro feel.
Yeah, I know. I mean, there is a lot of that, and I think it's central to what they're doing thematically as well. The main character, a lot of it is he has this choice that he keeps coming back to, and there's this prophecy as well where he has to decide: are you going to be kind to your family or your loved ones, or get revenge, right? And it's like the beast in him is being tugged in one way, and there's this gentle boy, there's this human inside him that he spent most of his life, he says several times, hating and wanting revenge and feeling the obligation for this revenge. But when he has a relationship with Olga, that brings out a whole human side of him. And you see it when he saves his half brother during the competition, whatever that was, right? There's a piece of him that wants to love. And so that is in conflict with this beast in him as well. You see it in the battle scene when they invade the berserkers invade the Slavic village. He's not enjoying this, right? He allows the beast out, but
I wouldn't go as far as saying he's not enjoying it.
He's not participating in the aftermath in the same way.
He's not participating in the aftermath, but
right.
The actual battle of unleashing that bestial side, he is fully immersed in that and is in that moment.
Oh yeah.
That he's not thinking about tomorrow. He's not thinking about anything more than the joy of battle, that battle rage. And that dualism that, I mentioned earlier, that everything in this film is set on those binaries, that constant tension between. And you mentioned it here about the love and desire for Olga, the witch, and the onerous duty. And we have to look at it that way, the onerous duty of exacting revenge, but also the desire for that revenge, because that is, again, it feels good to lash out. and he's spent his whole life hating. And that is going to be the fulfillment of that. It has been his driving force. And that's set in the unknown of, well, what do I do when I don't have that? I've lived my entire life with this hate. What happens when it's gone? What happens if I turn my back on it?
Yep. And you see that represented symbolically, that obligation toward vengeance, the remembrance of his father. The father, I mean, the father is first 5 minutes of the film, and he's not in the film anymore, but he's in the whole film, that presence. And I thought the actor Ethan Hawke, is that his name? Did a brilliant job playing or Vendil, or however they're saying it in the film. You see it physically manifested in the medallion, the coin that the father gives him. It's a constant reminder. You see it even when, one thing they did brilliantly is the last time we see the boy, he's rowing, right? He's rowing and he's saying, I will avenge you, father. I will save you, mother. I will kill you, uncle, you know?
Yeah.
And the next time we see him, what's he doing?
Rowing.
He's rowing, right? And he's an adult, and we get that medallion focused on again. It just gives you a sense that the weight of the past is on his very buff shoulders at this point, right?
And like, let's face it, the physicality that he brought to that role.
Oh yeah.
I don't know how many people he ate to be that big. Like, he is huge. And you know, if you compare him to earlier roles that he's had, like, he's always been a big guy.
Yeah.
Like even in True Blood, where he played Eric Northman, a Viking vampire. But even when he was a big guy there, he is huge here. Like, he is, so often when we see these Viking reenactments, in order to get actors to be believable at that sort of peak level of physique, where they can row for a rowboat for 12 hours straight, and then wield these weapons and wear the armor and scale walls. Like, that is a level of fitness that very few people really in the modern world can achieve.
Yeah.
And yet he is really believable that, yep, he looks absolutely the part. And some of his acting, I think people might mistake for, oh, he's just blank. So much of it is contained. You can see that tension in him. He doesn't do a lot of overly expressive views. It's a lot of it is very self-contained, and it's in his physical movement. It's in his posture. It's in how he holds himself.
Yeah.
And then there are times when the animal is unleashed and it becomes exaggerated. And again, we have that wild swing between binary oppositions.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, speaking of some binary oppositions, is it time to talk about mommy? I mean, it's a pretty important aspect of the film. And you mentioned Oedipus earlier. There is the scene where she turns into a bit of a seductress there toward the end. And this was foreshadowed in the beginning when he's a boy and he goes in the room to announce his father has come. And she turns around initially and says, don't ever come in here without, without asking, right? Without asking permission or knocking or whatever it is she says. I forget exactly what the line was, but I feel like that was a major foreshadowing of their relationship, because as it turns out, she wasn't so happy with her first husband, with Orvendel. At least that's what she says. I mean, you could argue that maybe this is a bit of Stockholm syndrome, but I don't think so. I think they set it up for us to actually believe that this character, she was part of the conspiracy to off Orvendel, to marry, what's the name of the uncle in this film? What did they name him?
I honestly, the names, they're all...
Hang on, I'll figure it out. Yeah. No, that's not what they named him. But anyway, you were going to say...
Well, one of the things I'd say about this is it is set up from the very beginning.
Yeah.
The first scene that we see is about the slaves. This is a slave trading and raiding and using culture. It is front and center from the very beginning that it is about slaves, and it's about using the slaves and then slaves rising and maybe being married off, families being constructed through this. This is a raiding culture.
Yep.
And it's something very foreign to us, most of us in the modern day. And the idea that she was originally a slave captive,
right, when she shows her brand,
he took an eye for, that he went, yeah, I like her. That is sort of signaled very early on. Look what happens with Amleth. Amleth falls in love with a slave.
Oh, there's some deliberate parallels there with the blonde hair and everything. Yeah.
The pattern repeats. It's all about repeating patterns. Yeah. And again, we're talking about vengeance being a cycle. You kill my father, I kill your father, you then kill me, my son kills you. And it's about cyclical patterns. So it's set up very early on. Yes, slaves. Yes, is about repeating patterns. So when the reveal comes that she was a slave and basically made the best of things because he was the king, and it is better to be the wife of the king instead of a slave.
But she didn't love him.
And to fall in love then with the king's brother, who was not as cruel, who was not a slave raider to the same extent, who wasn't the warrior to the same extent.
And who was a bastard as well. So he also has a kind of a mark on him, right?
And so that, when it is revealed, it makes perfect sense within the film. And then if you think of the mentality that you have to survive in that world, where, oh, so your husband's been murdered, right? Who murdered him? Well, if I marry him, I'll be okay.
Yeah.
But it's clear she dotes on her son, her youngest son, Gunnar.
Right.
Her middle son, maybe a bit of an asshole, or that might be a son by a different parent, who knows. And also she feared Amleth and sort of had given up on him.
Right.
So, I mean, there are a lot of conflicting emotions there. And I find that to be very, very believable. Her reaction and what was going on, I find that to be believable.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most convincing aspects of sort of the authentic recreation of this time period.
Yeah, there's something very unmaternal, though, about the scene when she sort of tries to seduce him. Now, maybe she's doing that to try to stall him, to delay him, to catch him out or something. Who knows? But and of course, later she stabs him, tries to kill him. So that's
she's not exactly filled with maternal instincts for Amleth. First of all, she hasn't seen him in 20 years. And so young boy goes running off, and she's been told he's dead, has mourned him if she loved, and I'm assuming she did love him at that stage.
Okay.
But has mourned him. He's dead. He's gone. Then this guy comes in and goes, yeah, I'm your son. And it's like, I don't know you from Adam. And so, it's a complex situation. I don't blame her for it.
Yeah, well, what's interesting in here is that no one character here is just pure good or anything like that. Amleth is a very complex, vicious in some ways. And if you look at it from her perspective, his father was a slaver. He was a rapist. He was not a nice guy. From that boy's perspective, he was a hero, right? Yeah. And this is what gets shattered for him in that scene with the mother. Like, okay, first of all, your father isn't what you think, and I'm not what you think either, buddy. Get used to it. And you got to get rid of this naive fairy tale that's going around in your head, okay? Because it has nothing to do with what really happens. And I think that's something they do in the film deliberately too. Obviously they do, because there's this interplay between ideals and reality, and you see that even in the mythological elements. Like, he's dreaming of Valhalla, and he wants to go there as a hero with a sword in his hand and all that. And what kind of destruction results from that? And that is something you see all over the film, and so that moment, that scene is a pivotal scene, because it's like suddenly the eyes are open there. And I mean, it's kind of Oedipus again, right? The theme of blindness and opening your eyes and seeing, okay, there's a different reality. This narrative that you've been running around with, it's all BS. And here's the truth, kid. And it's a tough moment for him.
But it's interesting because it ties into a theme of seeing and perception that runs all the way through. He doesn't see the problems with slavery. He doesn't really object to them taking a whole lot of women and children, putting them into a building and setting fire to it. He doesn't see that as a big problem.
Right.
You know, and then when you have, I think it's Bjork actually plays the
Bjork, yeah.
Is it the voice of one of the Fates or
She's a seeress or something. Yeah.
And again, this idea of sight and unsight, of seeing the perception of the magical, mythical reality.
She appears blind, the seeress. Yeah.
She appears blind, but sees better than him.
Right.
She can see the future, not what's around her in the present, except she knows it's him and she knows all about him. Right. All of this is playing with perception of reality, perception of our world around us. And even then, like some of these scenes that are mythological, are they in his head?
Right.
Are they actually happening? It struck me as much closer to magic realism than being what you would expect, say, an epic fantasy.
Yeah.
In fact, aspects of it reminded me quite a lot of the Guillermo del Toro movie. The
Labyrinth one? No.
Pan's Labyrinth.
Pan's Labyrinth. Yeah.
That is this real? Is it a fantastical creation? Yeah. And so much of that is about the perception of the world as being real or mythological. It's like, no, they are both true at the same time. His vision of his father is true. His mother's vision of her husband is true at the same time. It's about perception. It's about what they see. Yeah. He was a king. He was a great warrior. He also was a slaver and a rapist and a bad man. Yeah. But he was a good father. That they are not mutually exclusive views. They are more complicated views of a three-dimensional person rather than the two-dimensionality that we usually read into characters. That I think is a big aspect of this. And when we see Olga and her concentration on seeing, the seer the wizard in the cave, his perception of seeing, the fool at the beginning, seeing, all of this is about perception and about how what we see shapes the reality around us.
Yeah.
And we can blind ourselves to the truth of a situation. And that, I think, is very important.
Beautifully said. Great example, I think, of what you were talking about with the magic realism and all the theme of seeing and not seeing. The Barrow scene when he gets the sword. So we go through this whole scene with this creature that suddenly gets up and there's this large ghoul with the sword and they have a fight scene and it's really cool. And he succeeds in getting it to, stagger into the moonlight and he defeats it that way. And then it's him again picking up the sword, right? And I'm at first I was like, wait a second, why did they do that? I liked that scene before they had him go back and pick up the sword. Like it didn't actually happen at all, but it fits so much with what we've been talking about, this pattern of him having this epic saga in his head, having these myths and legends in his head, in his mind about, and having the reality sort of shoved in his face.
Or even when Olga puts the mushrooms in the food, and all of these people are having these visions and are incapacitated because he walks around killing a bunch of them, and they are seeing things that aren't there. Or are they now seeing the truth of that the veil has been lifted and they're actually seeing between worlds? That shamanistic beliefs and different ways of perceiving reality, all of this is coming into play. And it really is fascinating in that regard, that this runs all the way through. That when they are wearing those animal skins to become berserkers, are they the animal? Because we see that as they're running or crawling through the undergrowth to attack the Roos village.
When he catches the spear, that is like one of the best moves I've seen since Legolas jumped on the horse, the moving horse.
But the skins moving through the undergrowth, and you go, what? And then they stand up as warriors, as men. That you suddenly see the blend of legend and reality. That it's not as clear cut as, well, that's just not real.
Yeah.
Everything is about perception and sight.
Yeah, it's really brilliant. And I ended up kind of reflecting and thinking that barrow scene was actually kind of cool. I liked how they handled that. And Willem Dafoe, I mean, wow, that shriveled up jester. And later it really shriveled up because there's his head, you know.
That's how you get ahead in the seer business.
Oh, no. Boy, you're on a roll today, aren't you? Yeah.
Well, not as much as he would be if you just tipped his head down the hill.
But I like that. And I like also it's appropriate too, I thought, in a culture that in some ways you could say that the older Germanic cultures are less patriarchal than later medieval cultures tended to be under Christianity. But of course, they were still patriarchal. They had rules about gender and stuff. And to have this one figure who is a seer of a sort himself, he's wearing traditionally women's clothing. And he is defying, he's saying these social norms don't apply to me. Okay. I am not going to not only abide by these, but these don't have anything to do with me. He has a kind of wisdom that goes beyond that. And in that scene where Amleth meets him in the cave, and he basically tells him, here's what you got to do, buddy. You know, you got to get the sword, you got to blah, blah, blah. There's a moment where we were talking about dualities, where you have a figure here who defies these dualities, who has knowledge that goes beyond them. So I really liked what they did there. And there's precedent for that sort of thing in the sagas and such.
Yeah, well, and Loki.
Loki, yeah.
Loki learns magic from his mother because magic was a female skill.
Yeah.
But, you know, and Loki obviously is an incredibly gender fluid construction in the mythology.
Yeah, I mean, he literally gives birth, right? Yeah, so, yeah.
Well, but, you know, he was sounding a little hoarse.
Oh, dear.
But, you know, this is an aspect of it that, you know, is coming from the mythology that is so often overlooked, that, yeah, you know, magic was female. And in order then to be a mage, to be a magician, to be a sorcerer, to be a seer, dressing in female clothes, because those are the traditional garb that goes with it. And so much of, I think, the construction of Amleth as this powerful masculine ideal, and yet we see the deconstruction of what masculinity means in the film. You know, Willem Dafoe plays a male character dressed as a woman with woman skills in magic. The ideal father is revealed to be a brute. Amleth, when faced with, go with the woman that you love who's pregnant with your children and you can raise a family and actually have a future, go, nah, I'm gonna go and kill people instead.
Yeah.
The construction of what it means to be male, should he be a good father? That is clearly a positive masculine identity. To protect your family, positive masculine identity. Enact revenge when his uncle has already been kicked out of the kingdom, lost the majority of his men, is living in a shitty little farm somewhere, has lost all of his power. Like, just leave him to it. He's already lost. Your revenge is already complete. Yeah. And yet he takes that ideal, that vengeance, to the absurd limit, which is ultimately self-destructive.
Yep, absolutely. And you can see that it's his inheritance in a way. I mean, they literalize it with the metaphor of the tree, where they have all the people hanging from the tree, as in it was reminiscent of the practice of human sacrifice in old, you know, Viking Germanic culture, but at the same time, a representation of how we inherit from our parents, from the previous generations. We inherited this cycle of violence. And he sees it literalized in, well, they're hanging on this tree, you know, and then the branches are connecting them to each other. And all this is passed down the generations. So it's mythological, but it's a very potent metaphor too, isn't it?
So you see the connection to Yggdrasil, but also it's not presented in, oh, isn't this wonderful? Like, these are skeletons and broken figures that this is not attractive, but it's part and parcel of the duality, the beauty of the symbol, as well as the horror of it. When we talk about nature and nature being both beautiful and out to kill you, it's both. And I think that cycle gets emphasized.
Yeah.
But also the fact that he has this next generation. He's been promised this next year. He's been given this vision that he is going to have twins.
Yeah.
And what is going to happen to his son? What is his son going to do in the future?
Well, so he had basically one way of solving everything, which was violence. And you might see his final act as an act of sacrifice, because he says, I'm going to do both. I'm going to do something kind for my family, which is maybe leaving them so that he doesn't have that influence on his son. His son won't imbibe the same ideals that he imbibed from his father. So maybe he's breaking, that's in a way, that act of violence against his uncle, whom we need to talk about, probably some too, is also a way of being kind to his family, of breaking that cycle. And there's a son and a daughter I think that are portrayed on the tree, and they look more alive than anyone else on that tree. They look like actually just healthy people who are not sort of desiccated or ghost-like or whatever. So maybe there's a ray of hope in this bleak film.
But interestingly, when I'd said that, obviously this is futile and like it's destructive.
Yeah.
But at the end, we see his belief that he's being carried into Valhalla by the Valkyrie.
Right.
That he's rewarded. And even when he is fighting and killing these people, he's like, yeah, but we'll see each other in Valhalla. That it's not even enmity, that it's, I'm going to destroy you and you're going to get cast into Dis or hell or whatever. It's no, like, we both died in battle. So yeah, we'll raise mead in Valhalla. And you go, it's such a strange construction from the modern perspective.
Yeah.
And yet I think it fits as a representation of this is an incredibly complex society.
Right. That
the myths about tend to overwrite what actually happened. And I think one of the beautiful scenes in it that reflects the both beauty and violence of this society is the funeral for the son.
Yeah.
And the woman singing, who's been doing this beautiful singing all the way through, and she's the human sacrifice.
Yep.
And could you not have, killed one of the useless ones? Because at least
somebody who can't sing. Yeah.
But she's not fighting it. She believes in this as well. That and it's such a moment of cognitive dissonance for a modern audience to see someone very willingly participate in their own death on behalf of the funeral rites for someone else.
Yeah. And this is why I think the gates of hell scene at the end is the perfect way to do it. It's like the two cowboys meeting at high noon in the middle of the street, it's why the uncle doesn't kill Amleth when he discovers him initially with his dead son and wife, and says, I'm going to meet you at the gates of hell, which is, of course, the prophecy and all that goes into it. But it's also this sense of fitness. It's this sense of fate. It's this sense of, the weight of all of this that Amleth has been carrying around. The uncle shares that mentality. That's why they do it there. And of course, it's a brilliant scene. It's that cinematography in there and the starkness of it. And they're naked and they're still, going around and wow. I mean, it's a hell of a scene.
Unfortunately, because so many other big budget films have gone for that very evocative look before, it doesn't feel as original as maybe it should be. And you go, what can you do? Yeah. But what I thought was interesting about that was obviously Amleth is captured, is beaten, is hanging there. And
Yeah.
again, the uncle's like, no, we're not killing him yet.
He wants
And
his
if
heart.
everyone
He
in the
wants his
audience,
son's heart,
but everyone in the audience is like, oh, just kill him. Like, here, take my sword. You can kill him. We can kill him right now. And then he escapes, and we have the ravens. Again, that is it supernatural? Is it, or was it Olga had slipped in and actually done that because he sees the Valkyrie picking him up and taking him away, and she was going, no, that was me. But I wasn't carrying you all that way. We just got here.
Right.
This blend again of the supernatural versus the mundane.
Yeah, and it's sometimes subtle too, like with the sword. Sometimes it wouldn't come out because it wasn't the right time, and the one soldier tries to take it out, and he's like, "Huh," and then he throws it aside. So yeah, it's all over the place. Yeah.
But even the idea of the special magic sword that was, it's implied that it was made of the special ore that was a meteorite, steel. It was a steel sword, and everyone else is using iron.
Yeah.
But like little things like that. So they inscribed a special rune on it, and they gave it a story, and it has this mythos about it that mundane objects become magical. And that's why I said this was, I think, closer to magic realism than it was to either epic fantasy or historical epic. I think this is a magic realist film, and it doesn't matter if it is literally true or allegorically true. That distinction does not exist in the minds of the characters.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes from Amleth to Fjolnir is the uncle's name in the film. I remembered. And
I kept thinking his name was Fafnir, and I went, nope, that's
a different character. It's not. They've renamed him. Shakespeare called him Claudius, and he had a different name in Saxo Grammaticus, and but it's Fjolnir in here. So whatever.
But I thought, like, you've mentioned the Hamlet thing, and that's why I think people watching this might be not as shocked by what happens in it, because the story of Hamlet is so well known. Because I didn't know that this was based on an epic before I watched it. And then as I was watching it, I'm going, this reminds me an awful lot of Hamlet. All the way through the film, that was the thought going round. I've seen this before. Have they just ripped off Hamlet? And then I watched your video on this and went, well, that explains that then.
Both Shakespeare and the makers of Northman ripped off Saxo Grammaticus.
But I think those aspects of that made Hamlet so iconic. The family troubles, the madness elements, the supernatural elements, all those things that we see in Hamlet, we go, this makes it a great play. That's what we see recreated on the screen here. It is a Viking Hamlet that is going closer to the original text than the Shakespearean adaptation did.
Yeah, in some ways, yeah. In some ways, no. I would say Shakespeare does much more with the madness of Amleth as told by Saxo Grammaticus. That's the whole emphasis on how clever he is by deceiving his uncle into thinking him harmless, making him think he's not a threat. And he has to do this by acting like he's nuts, and Shakespeare goes with that. Whereas the film, The Northman, Amleth isn't necessarily feigning insanity, although he is playing a role when he becomes a slave, most certainly. Yeah. But I think they actually underplay that aspect of it. So,
but you see, and the reason I think they underplay that and have him do the slave role is it achieves the same narrative end, that he is perceived as non-threatening, that he is perceived as, oh yeah, we'll let him into the family, we'll let him get close. Whereas if he'd rocked up and went, yeah, I'm your nephew, oh, but I'm a wee bit mad, the uncle would just run him through. That's the sense that we as a modern audience would have. We go, well, why does the uncle accept him back?
Right.
So this actually is, I think it's one of those things that makes sense for a modern audience. That is one of the changes you have to make to an adaptation to sell it to your contemporary audience and not the original audience.
And interestingly, I think they make the mother, Gudrun, I think they call her in the film, less likable, at least in that one scene. It was like, whoa, okay, you know, there's a lot of anger here. There's a lot of and understandable. She was made a slave and all of that. So there's that whole side of it. But what they do with her is interesting. And in both Saxo Grammaticus and in Shakespeare's Gertrude, I think is a much more sympathetic character. She, in some ways, yes, had to collude, but she wasn't the instigator of Claudius's plot, right? And
that's a very sympathetic reading of Gertrude.
I mean, look, I guess let's put it this way. If you were in her situation, what would you do if your husband's brother kills your husband and then takes over the kingdom and says, you're going to be my wife now? And in those times, I don't think she was, you know, in the Northman, you know, Gudrun is an instigator. She is actively hates her first husband. And whereas.
And let me suggest to you that extension of empathy, sympathy, and understanding that you just offered out for Gertrude.
Yeah.
What would you do in the situation that you're a slave and the king of the kingdom rocks up and goes, yeah, I kind of like you. You're going to be my wife.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And I don't blame Gudrun for not exactly loving husband number one, you know. Although husband number two doesn't seem to be a whole lot better. He exhibits the same tendency when he's eyeing up Olga, and she has to come up with some very clever ways of putting him off, you know. So he's not much better, if he is any better at all, really.
No, and again, cycle of violence.
Yeah.
It all depends on whether or not you're the slave or you're the slave owner. Oh, look, slavery is really bad when you're a slave. Oh, I'm a slave owner. It's really handy having all these slaves to do this work for us.
Well, and their older son exhibits it perfectly. You know, you're a slave.
He was just an asshole.
Yeah, but his attitude would not have been seen as at all assholery. He would have been considered that what is the normal attitude about slaves and slavery and that sort of thing. So, although I will say that in their culture, he makes it sound like you're always going to be a slave. Thralls could actually buy their own freedom. So it wasn't quite as rigid as I think they portrayed in the film.
To be honest, I think he's more talking about the fact that they're on Iceland in a little tiny sort of farming village that they are setting up. You're never getting out of slavery here, mate.
Perhaps that's
because there isn't an opportunity for it. Whereas if they were in Jutland or any of the different Norse and Scandinavian territories that had trading, that had these things happen, that there were opportunities. That thralls are slightly different. And again, I don't want anyone to take this the wrong way. All slavery is bad. I think we can all accept that. Yeah. But thraldom isn't quite the same as some of the chattel slavery that we see in other cultures.
True.
Yeah. But yeah, still bad. I'm still saying all slavery is bad. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. AP said blah blah blah. So yeah, no, absolutely true. So I do agree with you that Gudrun is. I understand her resentment of Orvendil in this film.
And typically, the baby of the family is the one that gets all the affection. Doesn't care about the eldest son, the middle son, whatever. Youngest son, he can do no wrong.
Yeah. I think you're speaking as not a youngest child then there. Is that was fairly obvious?
Really? I thought I hit it perfectly well.
So, anything else you want to talk about from the film? Did we miss anything important?
I think one of the aspects that I kind of alluded to was the element of the natural world, but also the animalistic aspect. So we saw it, with them and the berserker scenes, but also the inclusion of the magical animals, the spirit animals, the totemic animals. Yeah, and they were wonderfully included. The ravens flying in at certain points. Was it a fox, an Icelandic fox?
I guess it looked like a very thick fox. But,
But again, bringing those little moments in was so well done. Because that totemic aspect of sagas and epics and these mythological stories it's very hard to recreate that sense of the omen connected to the sighting of certain animals.
Yeah.
And I really liked how they included it here. The snake and rope sort of thing.
Yeah.
Like all of these different aspects. And when we think of all of these ancient cultures, and those elements are always there. And I like that that was brought in. It again added to this sense that this really was an authentic epic, even if it diverged from the source material in certain narrative events. The tone, the style, the elements it was bringing together were far more authentic to that epic than Hamlet was, even if Hamlet is a wee bit closer to the specific narrative. But it was far and away very different from the sensibilities and the setting and the culture and all of those things. So I would forgive it an awful lot, because it really was the experience of seeing that alienness of a culture so far removed from ours in such sharp relief on the screen. And you have those moments where you're being challenged and it's uncomfortable and yet brilliant. And that's why I said, it's not one of those ones that go, oh, I really enjoy it. That was a lot of fun. There were moments that made you genuinely uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah.
And were incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
And very alien.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it spans the Viking world, if you will. It begins in Denmark. It goes all the way east to where the Rus were, who were originally from Sweden, and went all the way down to where modern Ukraine is. And it went all the way west to Iceland. So a really big part of the Viking landscape, if you will. And I loved, the overall portrayal of culture and the incorporation of myth and everything else. I think it's a very successful film. I really do.
There's a really nice moment where they're talking about all of the different slaves, and they mention the parts that they're sending the slaves off for sale. And it is across the known world, all the way down to Byzantium, and all the way across to the Rus, and all the way across to Iceland. It's the span of where Vikings traded and raided that is so often overlooked. It seems to be always very localized. Oh, it was just up in the North Atlantic. They went everywhere, and they raided everywhere. They had a massive impact and brought things back from all over the world. So I like that that's included as an aside, just as a bit of flavor in the text, as they're talking about these things while you're standing there looking at the abject misery of human slavery. So I think this is a very brutal film in places. Both in the visuals and in the violence. It's brutal in terms of humanity's inhumanity to other humans. It's brutal in vengeance being so destructive. And yet there are moments of beauty and tenderness and wonder in it, and moments of awe. And it really is a fantastic film. And I would recommend seeing it. But again, it's one of those ones that I sort of sit back and go, I'm glad I saw it, but I'm not going to go, oh yeah, that was a lot of fun. It's just, it's not that experience. So I thought it was a brilliant film, and I was really engaged in it, and thematically, symbolically, cinemagraphically, the soundscape, all of these things just were so wonderfully realized.
And I think that is a great way to finish our discussion. I agree with everything you just said. You expressed it perfectly right there. So thank you so much, AP. It is always a pleasure to talk with you, my friend. And I loved, hearing your insights here. And, you have a bit of Scandinavian, running around in Ireland. So you may have some Viking roots in you. Who knows, right?
Well, I'm sure if anyone did DNA tests, it's like the Celts and the various Vikings. I think we're all pretty much interbred.
Yeah, yes, for sure. All right. Well, anyway, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for listening to this. If you've gotten this far, and it's just always fun to talk with you, AP. So thank you again. And everyone, until next time.